Right, there you go, colleagues. It has just turned 5 o'clock, and I think that we should start the proceedings. I see that there are still people being allowed into the main room. So I think, but by the time that Paul will be starting, I think that would be sorted out. Uh, just to say, friends and friends, of course, welcome again to our Advancing Critical University Studies Africa Colloquium. And thanks to those who attended yesterday to share experiences and helping us think on how to build the network. And we had earlier discussions also with Amos and Michael and Paul on how to build the network further on the continent. We'll take up some of those suggestions. Our session today will have a keynote provocation from Paul Zeleza on transforming African universities and epistemic cultures in the post-COVID-19 world. Nobu will formally introduce Paul. Dina and Michael will forgive me when I say that though this colloquium is a partnership with Queen's University Belfast and the University of Ghana under the CUS umbrella, I would like to, from the side of our Vice Chancellor, the executive and the university community, extend our warmest welcome to Paul as he makes his first formal appearance as a Mandela University honorary professor on the proverbial home soil. Welcome also to the Critical University Studies community, Paul. I know that you like the network and I know that you like what you see on our webpage. We know that these are somber times in general and for you in particular. We are grateful for you joining us. And to all of us attending, please feel the warmest of welcomes. Enjoy the session. Thanks so much, Paul. Nobu?
Thanks so much, Prof. Kiet. Molweni again, allow me to reiterate the welcome that Prof. Kiet has already extended to everyone. My name is Nobubele Phuza. A lot of people know me as Nobu. I am an emerging or an early career academic, and I'm told by Prof. Njunguna that we use that term to excuse so many things. So today, allow me to use that term to excuse any possible bandwidth or connectivity issues. But as we all know, if there are no complications, then it's not the internet, right? A reminder that the session will be recorded and we will be capturing the questions from the chat as well. So please feel free, even in the breakaway sessions a little bit later, to use the chat to share your thoughts and to share any notes as the session progresses. As Prof. Kiet has already said, we have Prof. Zeleza with us today, who will be taking us through his thoughts on transforming African universities and epistemic cultures in the post-COVID-19 world. And I assume that the bio that was sent has already been, the bio that was circulated on the invitation has already been read. But just as a reminder of who Professor Zeleza is, he is a renowned scholar, a public intellectual, and a seasoned university administrator with experience in the higher education sector in 6 countries on 3 continents. He is an award-winning author of more than 24 books and hundreds of academic articles and popular essays. He's skilled in academic governance, in policy analysis, lecturing and public speaking, as well as in African gender and diaspora and development studies. Currently, Prof. Zeleza is the Vice Chancellor and Professor of the Humanities and Social Sciences at the United States International University of Africa, a position he has held since 2016. Prof. Zeleza, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nobu, for that wonderful introductions. Let me also thank Andre and all the people who've been involved in this very important initiative. It is critical that those of us committed to higher education have a space in which we can reflect and share ideas about our sector. I'm going to talk to you about some of the transformations that I think are needed for our universities as we grapple with some of the challenges caused by COVID-19, but also, of course, the challenges that have been there before. So what I'm going to do is talk to you about a number of issues, two in particular. And one of the issues I'm going to be discussing is the challenges exposed and exacerbated by the pandemic. And in that, I will share with you 10 existing challenges of African investors very briefly, technological deficits, financial strains, and research demands that have been engendered by COVID-19. And then the second part, I'll try to talk about some of the reforms that I think are needed. Again, this is all very, very brief. 12-point agenda for promoting digital transformation, 12 strategies for enhancing leadership skills for our universities, and what I call 7 strategies for strengthening academic cultures, and then another 7 strategies for promoting financial sustainability. The COVID-19 pandemic, as we all know, has exposed and exacerbated the systemic deficiencies and inequalities in healthcare systems, economies, businesses, and education institutions around the world. African universities have been particularly affected. What does this portend for their future and for the production, consumption, and dissemination of scholarly knowledges? In the paper, I argue that African universities face various alternative and overlapping futures ranging from restoration to evolution to transformation. These interlinked scenarios encompass every aspect of university affairs, from the modalities of teaching and learning, financial models, leadership skills, and institutional governance systems to modes of external engagements. In this context, it is critical to interrogate the desirable transformative trajectories for African universities and African studies as a constellation of knowledges on, about, and for Africa. Constructing new futures for African universities and knowledge economies entails institutional, intellectual, ideological struggles and negotiations, and different ways of studying and assessing the value proposition of universities, not only for students and other internal stakeholders, but also for African societies and diasporas in their complex national and transnational dimensions, articulations, and intersections. So first of all, the challenges exposed and exacerbated by the pandemic. The outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic in early 2020 forced universities around the world to confront unprecedented challenges that simultaneously exposed and exacerbated existing deficiencies and dysfunctions. 6 stand out. First, in terms of transitioning from face-to-face to remote teaching and learning using online platforms. Second, managing severely strained finances. Third, ensuring the physical and mental health of students, faculty, and staff. Fourth, reopening campuses as safely and as effectively as possible. Fifth, planning for a sustainable post-pandemic future. Sixth, contributing to the capacity of government and society in resolving the multiple dimensions of the COVID-19 pandemic. Universities in Africa were among the most affected and least able to manage the multi-pronged crisis because of their pre-existing capacity challenges that centered on 10 dimensions, namely institutional supply, financial resources, human capital, research output, physical and technological infrastructures, leadership and governance, academic cultures, quality of graduates, patterns of internationalization, and global rankings. The first refers to the inadequate number of universities on the continent, 8.9% of the global total in 2018, and low enrollment ratios, about 13% compared to the world average of 38%. The second concerns inadequate financing, declining public investment, and limited philanthropic support for higher education. The third is about the insufficient availability of faculty and lessening attractiveness of academic careers because of the devaluation of academic labor. The fourth points to low levels of research funding and productivity, in which Africa accounted for only 1.3% of global R&D and 2.6% of scientific publications in 2014, compared to 39.5% for Asia. The fifth alludes to the poor state and maintenance of physical and technological infrastructures. The sixth touches on external interference and politicization of university executive appointments, corporatization, and lack of leadership development opportunities. The seventh suggests growing social conflicts with the pluralization of internal and external constituencies and erosion of academic freedom. The eighth signifies persistent mismatches between graduates and the needs of the economy that results in high levels of unemployability. The ninth implies the durability of coloniality, intellectual dependency, and unequal international engagements. The 10th indicates the low standing of African universities in world rankings, notwithstanding the problems with rankings as instruments of global academic capitalism. Some of these institutional deficits directly affected the ability of universities to manage the pandemic and to plan for the post-pandemic future. Most crucial are the technological, financial, and research capacities, and the state of institutional cultures and leadership. Many African universities suffered from limited digital infrastructure, capacity, and connectivity, which made it difficult for them to transition online for education, research, and administration. The digital divide was evident among and within countries and institutions in terms of access to broadband, electronic gadgets, data costs, digital literacy, and preparedness for administrators, faculty, staff, and students. Digital inequalities reflected and reinforced the prevailing differentiations of class, gender, age, race, location, disability, and other social markers. The technological challenges were compounded by worsening financial strains. University revenues from auxiliary services plummeted following campus closures. Student enrollments and ability to pay tuition dropped sharply as economies went into recession, and unemployment for parents or guardians rose. Government funding declined, and philanthropic donations fell and were increasingly diverted to emergency healthcare. Investors were forced to undertake severe budget cuts, including job furloughs, reductions in salaries and pensions, suspension of capital projects, and renegotiation of service contracts. Some stayed at the brink of bankruptcy and permanent closure. Under such circumstances, new investments in electronic infrastructures were difficult to support and sustain. The financial crisis was, of course, not confined to Africa or developing countries. A report by UNESCO entitled COVID-19 and Higher Education Today and Tomorrow, Impact Analysis, Policy Responses and Recommendations opens with a stark statement, I quote, "To say the least, we were not prepared for disruption of this magnitude. Almost overnight, schools and universities around the world closed their gates, affecting 1.57 billion students in 191 countries. Regardless of the level of education, the paramount danger is that learning inequities will widen, marginalization will increase, and the most disadvantaged students will find themselves unable to pursue their studies," end of quote. It urged governments to include higher education in stimulus plans for economic and social recovery, and for universities to ensure teaching continuity and guaranteeing equity. For its part, a report by the European University Association entitled "The Impact of the COVID-19 Crisis on University Funding in Europe, Lessons Learned from the 2008 Global Financial Crisis," it states, I quote, "The coronavirus pandemic that has swept over Europe and the rest of the world has posed unprecedented challenges for all sectors of the economy, and higher education is no exception," end of quote. It noted all sources of university income would be affected in some way in the short to medium term. Public funding, tuition fees, research contracts, philanthropy, and other sources of income were all in decline. Universities would have limited options to reduce their costs, and the need for ambitious, coordinated action at the European level was greater than ever. Major markets for higher education were not spared. In early February 2021, it was reported from Australia that, quote, "Australia's financially troubled universities have been forced to slash the jobs of more than 17,000 staff after losing an estimated Australian $1.8 billion in revenue. The higher education sector is estimated to lose a further 5.5%, or at least $2 billion Australian dollars in 2021. In the United Kingdom, the BBC announced investors were facing an estimated 11 billion pound loss, amounting to a quarter of the sector's annual income. Without significant redundancies, which would impact on teaching quality, investors are likely to be able to claw back, unlikely to be able to claw back much of the losses through cost savings. And it noted out of the 65, the country's 165 higher education institutions, 13 universities, quote, will not be viable in the long run without government bailout or debt restructuring, end of quote. In Canada, universities were expected to lose as much as 3.4 billion Canadian dollars in 2020, quote, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, Statistics Canada has projected, end of quote. A Maclean's magazine wondered with alarm, that is a well-known Canadian magazine, quote, the pandemic piled on top of an already delicate situation raises an almost unthinkable question. Will Canadian universities survive COVID-19, end of quote. In the United States, the higher education sector was already in financial crisis before COVID-19 struck, as evident in the astronomical 1.6 trillion student debt, which was higher than credit card debt. In October 2020, the New York Times observed, I quote, the pandemic has cost colleges at least $120 billion, with even Harvard University, despite its $41.9 billion endowment, reporting a $10 million deficit that has prompted belt tightening, end of quote. In December 2020, the Chronicle of Higher Education reported preliminary estimates suggest that a net 560,000 fewer workers were employed by America's private, non-profit, and for-profit and state-controlled institutions of higher education in October compared with February, according to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. Put another way, American universities and colleges have shed at least 12% of the workers they employed at the start of the pandemic, end of quote. This was the largest loss of jobs in the sector since the Bureau started keeping statistics in the late 1950s. Coming closer to home, in Kenya, in December 2020, the Daily Nation published a sobering story. Quote, Kenyan universities, we are broke, send us what you owe, end of quote. It noted, I quote, universities are facing an acute financial crisis due to inadequate funding from the government, a situation that could lead to mass layoffs when the institutions open in January. The universities have cumulatively requested 20 billion shillings additional funding to get them out of their financial woes, as well as cushion them from debt. The universities want the government to support them and help them recover from the financial effects of the pandemic. The total statutory deductions debt owed by universities by September 2020 is about 37.7 billion shillings, end of quote. In February 2021, the other Kenyan daily, The Standard, carried a story with a headline, quote, thousands of non-teaching staff in varsities to be laid off to ease the institution's financial burden, end of quote. African universities were also expected to undertake biomedical and socioeconomic research to manage the pandemic. As I noted in an article in University World News, summarizing a series of webinars I moderated, some universities produced hygiene products and personal protective equipment, including hand sanitizers, masks, ventilators, EpiTents for patient isolation, and mobile hospitals, testing kits and robots for delivery of food and medicines to patients. Others produced research on the epidemiology of the coronavirus and biomedical treatments and the socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic, provided advisory services to government, developed software to monitor the pandemic's spread and sought to raise awareness and provide psychosocial support to their constituents and the wider society. However, most African universities and firms stood on the sidelines as their societies waited for the development of vaccines in the global north, China, and India. At best, a few collaborated with overseas universities, research establishments, and networks, and hosted clinical trials, although they were, quote, unable to secure a fair pricing agreement, end of quote. For example, despite participating in clinical trial of the AstraZeneca vaccine, South Africa ended up paying US $5.25 per dose, quote, more than double the US $2.6 per dose paid by European Union countries to AstraZeneca, end of quote. Weak research and drug manufacturing capabilities have made African countries vulnerable to vaccine nationalism, while democratic deficits have led to the securitization of mitigation measures, gravely undermining human rights in several countries. COVID-19 should be a wake-up call to African universities and countries to strengthen their research capacities, science, technology, and innovation systems, manufacturing capabilities, and interinstitutional and interdisciplinary collaboration through existing consortia, such as the African Research Universities Alliance and new ones. Beyond being involved in quality control and to have an important role to protect the continent code from being used as a testing lab for COVID-19 vaccines, some believe African universities should join forces with the pharmaceutical industry and fund organizations to manufacture COVID-19 vaccines in the continent, end of quote. Funding for research by governments, the private sector, and the universities, and collaborations among the three needs to be enhanced. Despite innovations made in some universities, quote, the scale of collaboration with the industry that takes headline making innovation beyond the walls of an institution is conspicuously missing. These collaborations can also provide an opportunity for further validation and a path towards widespread adoption and commercialization, end of quote. How many African countries have followed the example of India, already the largest producer of vaccines, in making new investments and increasing budgetary allocations to research and development since the pandemic? Quote, the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines and involvement in vaccine diplomacy around the world has led to a significant boost in health spending and scientific research. Some Indian rupee 500 billion or $6.9 billion US over 5 years was announced in the budget in February 2021, end of quote. What should be the agenda for transformation, for reform and transformation in Africa? A crisis, the saying goes, is the flip side of opportunity. The bigger the crisis, the more profound the lessons to be learned, and the greater the imperatives for transformation. African universities are likely to pursue three scenarios. The restore scenario will be focused on reclaiming the institution's pre-pandemic financial health, while the evolve scenario applies to institutions that will choose to incorporate the impact and lessons of the pandemic into their culture and vision. And the transform scenario, institutions will use the pandemic to launch or accelerate an institutional transformation agenda. For some universities, what is at stake is survival. For others, stability. And for many, sustainability. Institutional survival is a precondition for stability, which is essential for sustainability. Confronting the entire higher education sector is the question of its raison d'etre, its value proposition in a digitalized world accelerated by COVID-19. I would like to focus on four critical dimensions: promoting progressive digital transformation, effective leadership, strong institutional cultures, and sustainable funding for African universities. For the first two, I propose a dozen strategies for each, and for the last two, 7 strategies for each, respectively. Given the limitations of time, I'll only give broad outlines of the various proposed initiatives. As a scholar of intellectual history, the history of ideas and knowledge-producing institutions, I'm only too aware knowledge production is framed by certain crucial dynamics, what I call the 4 I's. First, intellectual, which refers to the prevailing paradigms. Second, ideological, in terms of the dominant and competing ideologies at a given moment. Third, institutional, as far as the nature and organization of an institution is concerned. And finally, individual, one's social biography with reference to gender, race, nationality, class, religion, politics, etc. Institutional change occurs in the intersections of these dynamics, out of concrete social struggles within and outside the academy, among the university's ever-expanding and shifting constituencies. Change, in short, does not emanate from analytical prescriptions or rhetorical declarations, however compelling. However, constructing desired futures is not a wasteful exercise. It can inspire action, for ideas constitute an indispensable part of praxis. In a forthcoming co-authored paper with Paul Okanda, USIU's ICT director, in the Journal of African Higher Education, whose abridged version appeared in University World News last week, a 12-point agenda is proposed for the digital transformation of African universities. First, they need to embed digital transformation in institutional culture, from strategic planning, organizational structures, to operational processes. Second, invest in digital infrastructure by rethinking capital expenditures that historically favored physical plant. Third, develop online design competencies, both individually and through consortia. Fourth, entrench technology-mediated modalities of teaching and learning, encompassing face-to-face, blended, and online. Fifth, embrace pedagogical changes in terms of curricular design and delivery that involves students as active participants in the learning process rather than passive consumers. Sixth, develop holistic and innovative curricula that imparts skills for the jobs of the 21st century. Seventh, adopt and use educational technologies that support the whole student for student success, going beyond degree completion. Eighth, develop effective policies and interventions to address the digital divide and issues of mental health disorders and learning disability. Ninth, as learning and student life move seamlessly across digital, physical, and social experiences, universities must safeguard data protection, security, and privacy. 10th, insofar as the market for online programs is transnational, universities must pay special attention to international students who face unique barriers. 11th, they should develop meaningful partnerships with external constituencies and stakeholders, including digital technology and telecommunication companies, to close the glaring employability gap. Finally, universities will increasingly be expected to anchor their research and innovation in the technological infrastructure that supports and enhances the opportunities of the fourth industrial revolution for Africa. As for effective leadership, I also see 12 areas for improvement. The multi-pronged health, economic, financial, and social crisis of COVID-19 have underscored the importance of strategic and smart institutional leadership at all levels. First, it requires ensuring that appointment for institutional heads and governance boards are based on verifiable leadership competencies, passion, and understanding of the higher education sector. All too often, their selection reflects misguided political considerations, expectations of donations, which are hardly honored in African universities, or preferences for alumni wedded to institutional nostalgia and stasis. Second, university leaders at all levels, from department chairs to deans, vice chancellors to board members, must undergo leadership development training specifically tailored for higher education. Third, university leaders must possess and sharpen their financial acuity. In addition to managing complex institutional budgets, they now need to develop ability to manage reductions in staffing, programs, and space. Fourth, cultural competency is more critical than ever. University leaders must go beyond making statements on valuing diversity and inclusion and articulate and exhibit deeper awareness of systemic injustice, inequality, and privilege, and show boundless compassion and commitment for promoting an inclusive institution. Fifth, they must display technological deftness. In an increasingly digitalized academy, it's no longer enough for university leaders to be comfortable using emerging technologies, but to model and promote institutional technological savviness and competence, and develop analytics expertise to promote data-driven decision-making. Sixth, the pandemic has shown that crisis management is essential. Besides preparing for traditional, natural, and security threats, leaders are currently forced to manage physical and mental health crisis, emergency preparedness, and business continuity, and leading in times of uncertainty. Seventh, leaders need an entrepreneurial mindset. More than ever, universities want leaders who are calculated risk takers, innovative entrepreneurs, and effective in promoting the university mission as they create beneficial external partnerships and revenue generation initiatives. Eighth, political savviness is an important asset, as university leaders are increasingly required to work in uncertain and politically polarized times at national, regional, and global levels that challenge them to pursue and promote advocacy and institutional discourse that is calm, informed, and respectful. Ninth, empathy and respect is essential, as mental stress and financial insecurity rise among university constituencies. Leaders, therefore, are expected to demonstrate empathy and respect for all their internal constituencies. They must reveal their humanity, even in decision-making. 10th, multi-genre communication skills are indispensable. Further to strong written and verbal communication skills, leaders are now increasingly expected to provide efficient, timely, clear, and persuasive messages and stories to diverse constituencies using multiple platforms, including social media. 11th, possessing high emotional intelligence is a must. Additional to the ability to demonstrate confidence and empathy, leaders are more and more expected to demonstrate self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, and social skills, rather than egotism, impulsivity, and proneness to bullying and micromanagement. Finally, agility is necessary. On top of well-established professional knowledge and experience, success increasingly depends on a leader's ability to be flexible in the face of many changes, have the capacity to learn and assume new and more responsibilities, and show fortitude and flappability and moral compass. Building strong institutional cultures requires adherence to 7 critical values. First is academic freedom, which in most jurisdictions embodies 2 dimensions: the freedom of inquiry for faculty and students, and the procedural and substantive autonomy of institutions. In the first instance, a faculty member should be able to teach or express scholarly views without fear of reprisals. And in the second, an institution has the right to determine for itself on academic grounds how its core business of teaching and research is conducted. In many African countries and universities, academic freedom in both senses is contested and often breached by pervasive authoritarian interventions and impulses by the state, administration, and governing boards. Second is shared governance, which refers to the participation and demarcation of rights and responsibilities in decision-making between faculty, management, and governing boards. Typically, faculty is expected to exercise authority on academic matters, such as the curriculum, instruction, and degree requirements. As universities have become more complex and demands for accountability increased, democratic organizational processes have been eroded, replaced by what some critics call corporatization and managerialism. It is critical to balance the management of the university as a complex organization and the traditions and ethos of collegiality, participation, and distributed power by maintaining what some in South Africa call cooperative governance. Third is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Given their critical role as pathways for social mobility and leadership across all sectors, universities are increasingly expected to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion at all levels and for all their constituencies. Inequalities of access, support, and success are deeply entrenched across Africa's and the world's multicultural, multiracial, and multi-ethnic, gendered, and class societies that are also marked by other forms of difference and discrimination. By providing opportunities for underrepresented groups and creating and sustaining an inclusive climate through their mission, values, policies, and practices, universities promote inclusive excellence for institutional and national progress. Fourth, civility and collegiality. The academic bully culture, as Dala Twale and Barbara DeLuca call it in their book by that title, has grown. Incivility and intolerance in universities are several manifestations. At a macro level, it reflects the frictions of increasing diversification of university stakeholders, growing external pressures for accountability, and the descent of political discourse into angry populisms. Student and faculty incivility are also fueled by rising sense of entitlement, consumerist attitudes, emotional immaturity, stress, racism, tribalism, sexism, ageism, xenophobia, social media, and other pervasive social and institutional ills that our universities must confront and address to foster healthier institutional climates. Fifth, universities must maintain their role as generative spaces in the rigorous search for truth. The posts and the movement for decolonizing knowledge have vigorously and rightly contested the epistemic architecture and meta-narratives of the Eurocentric academy and its hegemonic knowledges. However, as we pluralize knowledges and universalisms, remake intellectual cultures, and transform our universities, we must resist the relativism of alternative facts, the nihilism of anti-science, the solipsism of self-referentiality, beloved by populist demagogues, many of them products of the world's leading universities, as some critics noted, with the neo-fascist, Trumpist, and Ivy League educated Senators Cruz and Hawley in the United States, who led the assault against certifying President Biden's election based on the lie of election rigging. Sixth, effective communication is essential for building cohesive communities out of the university's disparate constituencies that have divergent interests, priorities, and preferences. Internally, there are students, faculty, staff, administrators, and governance boards, and externally, prospective students and employees, alumni, parents, government, regulatory agencies, competitors, institutional partners, donors, the media, and general public. This requires developing multiple communication channels, messages, and styles tailored for different audiences to create dialogue and understanding. Good, transparent, and regular internal communication fosters a sense of community, efficiency, and the collective pursuit of institutional mission, vision, and goals. Seventh, embracing social responsibility is vital for universities to eschew institutional navel-gazing for the higher purpose of social impact that can mobilize internal and external stakeholders. Universities are well placed to provide evidence-based knowledge, solutions, and innovations for society. Socially responsible universities need to embed public service in their missions, experiential learning in their curricula, and research that is responsive to pressing local, national, regional, and global problems, as was stressed at a virtual international conference at the University of Pretoria early this month. They need to enhance their social ownership as public goods in tackling social inequities and embrace research sharing with their communities. Finally, financial sustainability requires pursuing 7 strategies as well. First, public funding for higher education needs to be raised substantially. If African countries are serious about improving the quality of human capital, so essential for integrated and innovative sustainable development, and for them to turn the demographic explosion into a dividend rather than a disaster. The burial of the ghosts of structural adjustment programs is long overdue. African governments need to develop innovative allocation mechanisms to universities encompassing clear funding formulas, performance contracts, and competitive grants. The latter two should be open to both public and private universities. Second, establishing differentiated tuition pricing and targeted student aid. Besides increasing spending per student, which is the lowest in the world, African governments and universities must develop targeted free or low tuition for the neediest students who qualify for university studies, improve student loan recovery schemes, and make them income contingent. Private universities can do this through internal student aid policies and external scholarships. Third, exercising prudent financial management. As I noted in the framing paper for the first Higher Education Summit held in Dakar in March 2015, quote, financial challenges facing higher education institutions require the adoption of more sophisticated and transparent budgeting models to ensure efficient utilization of limited resources. The specter of corruption that undermines the finances of some universities should also be ruthlessly tackled, end of quote. Fourth, diversifying revenue streams. Universities tend to have 6 major sources of funding, namely government subsidies, student tuition, auxiliary services, income-generating activities, research grants, and philanthropic donations and loans. African universities could increase income from auxiliary services by providing better accommodation for their students rather than leaving them captive to shoddy and dangerous neighborhoods, as has become the case on many campuses. Undertaking entrepreneurial activities, including consultancies, offering executive programs, and establishing enterprises that leverage their expertise and innovations, and raising philanthropic donations from Africa's rapidly expanding middle classes. and especially high net worth individuals, whose numbers reached 200,000 in 2017, with a collective wealth of $1.7 trillion. Fifth, creating institutional mergers. There is no doubt that Africa needs more investors, but they must be financially sustainable. Many of the public and private universities that have mushroomed in the last 2 decades are simply glorified high schools. For economies of scale in the higher education sector, mergers are imperative for the fiercely independent and often thinly disguised for-profit private universities. This has to be part of a strategic agenda for diversification, differentiation, and articulation, accompanied by horizontal and vertical articulation of higher education institutions at national, regional, and continental levels. Sixth, forging robust interinstitutional collaborations is essential. University consortia will become increasingly necessary to promote quality education, facilitate cost sharing and bargaining in the procurement of expensive technological infrastructures, instructional materials, talent development, and to facilitate the mobility of students, faculty, credit transfer, and development of interinstitutional innovative programs and practices. Finally, strengthening external partnerships with other higher education institutions and non-academic sectors and organizations is important. Odd patterns of asymmetrical internationalization under which Africa was subordinated to Euro-American institutional and epistemological systems must be replaced by strategic inclusion, mutuality, and co-creation of activities and initiatives, and humanization by abandoning exploitative internationalization in which foreign students are treated as cash cows. Also important are partnerships with the private sector, which underinvests in skills and needs to complement government funding in promoting high quality education and reduce the much bemoaned skills gaps. Universities have to be discerning, however, in establishing public-private partnerships to ensure they are not exploited, as has happened to some universities. Critical players also include African international and intergovernmental agencies that often play second fiddle to their foreign counterparts in funding university activities and formulating policies. Higher education is too important for Africa's future to be held captive to haphazard interventions and superficial reforms. What is needed is fundamental transformation, thanks in part to the massive disruptions of COVID-19. Studies show the return on investment for education are much higher for society and individuals than any other form of investment. This applies to all levels, including tertiary, not just primary education, as we were told by the misguided missionaries who propagated the neoliberal assault on universities during Africa's lost decades of the 1980s and 1990s, with the connivance of anti-intellectual and anti-developmental African states. I believe we can remake the future of African higher education. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof, for that powerful offering. You have given us a lot of points to discuss as we go into the breakaway sessions. If I could direct you as well, Prof. Zeleza, to the conversation on the chat that your presentation has already sparked. We're hoping that colleagues keep the conversation going as we go into the breakaway rooms. At this point, Dr. Jenny Dupree will be moving people into smaller groups. In those groups, we're hoping people will be able to discuss and reflect on the presentation. We haven't formally allocated a facilitator, but we do hope that someone will assume this role in each room. After about 30 minutes, 25 minutes, I'm hoping, we will come back to the main room and hear back from those groups. I believe there's 4 groups. Please remember, if someone can record the session, that would be wonderful, so that we have the reflections as part of our records. If there are any questions that emerge from the sessions, please include them in the feedback as well, so that Prof. Zeleza can tackle them in his response and his closing remarks. Dr. Genzo, can I hand over to you to allocate people to those breakaway rooms? Colleagues, we have about 25 minutes for the session, and then please, if people could honor the time and come back once you get the blue reminder at the top of your screen. Dr. Jenzo?
Thanks, Nobu. So I'm just going to break everyone up into 4 groups. There will be someone in your group to record, so you don't have to worry about that. But if you could just nominate a facilitator and a scribe and someone to report back when we return, each group will have 5 minutes to report back. And Prof. Zeleza will be moving between the different rooms to engage, and then also will respond to your feedback in the final 20 minutes of the session. So yes, I'm going to open those rooms. If you will please join, you should get an invitation to join your room, and you can just go ahead and do that. Thank you.
Okay.
You should be able
So
to
we'll
share.
start with Sue's room.
Okay, hopefully that's going to work now. I was trying to close some of the windows because I have so many windows. Okay, let me see. Jenny knows. Oh God, sorry, that's not working.
It's there, Sue.
Is it there? Can you see
Yes.
it? Does
Yes.
it say breakout group 1 on it?
Yes. yes.
Oh, great, because all I can see is my incredibly disorganized desktop. Okay, how long do you want me to just speak for? Just a second?
If we can just limit it to about 5 minutes per group, that'll be
Okay.
great.
So in our group, we started first of all with me and my big mouth talking. And I was just reflecting really on this kind of combination of the sudden crisis, pandemic crisis, bringing to the fore the slow crisis that was there in higher education, a crisis of unsustainability of higher education, the many pressures that are on it, and the problem of survival for society generally. Whilst the COVID pandemic is making these problems more visible, highlighting the gaps that are there, but it's really about the basic unsustainability that was lying behind the problems that our institutions face. And then there was a response, I think, to Professor Zeleza's very pragmatic approach, and maybe over focusing on the financial aspects of sustainability, but not actually facing this kind of slow crisis that was behind the fact that the broader economic system is not working. So focusing too much on the entrepreneurial side and raising finance could actually lead to not seeing higher education as the public good for, and that has to be maintained for people, for a sustainable climate for societies. And it's not to say that the model was perfect in the past, but running back to the entrepreneurial capitalist model is maybe not the answer. This question about the public aspect of the university also has been overshadowed by maybe the more sudden and of the moment concern with the move online. The fact that not everyone can learn effectively online and get what they want from the institution online. Online has limitations. Many types of students need to be on the campus. And there's this public aspect of the campus and of the university, which is overshadowed by the move online, because the campus offers important spaces, grounds, a place where people can come, do things, have things that they can use, technology, spaces, and participate and meet other people and have common conversations with them. So that public aspect of the university may be overshadowed by this practical need to go online. And perhaps, this online pivot also has caused a more narrowed view of education where we simply think of, those who have connectivity versus those who don't have connectivity. And really, the pivot online has taught us many things, that we have had also positive experiences by returning education to the life context, whether it's in rural families or in rural places or in people's homes with their families and kids and their siblings and parents or whatever. But at the same time, also there are gaps where maybe students are not actually coping, and on the other hand, maybe they are actually learning well. So this kind of raises questions of the relevance of learning and how radical it is to return learning back to life rather than to focus on its institutionalized historical forms, because students are working while learning. Though this also leads us to this question of, is the learning relevant, and are we, preparing people for the job market? There's a question there about, whether, arts is going to remain important. Though that's not so much the case in my university, where arts is very important from a employment point of view. Then from an interesting point about how the pivot online and pandemic may actually have improved student performance, and the jury is still out on this, but actually, staff and students both have had opportunities to rethink how they deliver learning and take it up. Though we can't assume that all the supports and tools that are necessary are accessible and there for the academics and the students. There was a query about the question about politicization of appointments. There was a desire to hear more about issues of decoloniality in the curriculum or otherwise, and then a plea from the student perspective around accessing needed facilities, specifically psychosocial support, and having a different approach to it, which is not just to get school done, but to support people and in a holistic way. So sorry if I took a little bit more than the 5 minutes there, but that was everything.
Thanks so much, Sue. Can we move to Oriel's group?
Hello, I'm the reporter, the on-site reporter for room 2. I just thank you, Nomalanga, for chairing our session, facilitating that session. Please note that as I present, I'm going to mention names, but I may not convey the fullness of what every speaker has said. So individuals in room 2, please feel free to add on to what I've said. If I've misrepresented you, please correct me. So Roxana gave us a broad diasporic view from her experience in the USA, Canada, and African institutions. And she highlighted the brevity of the crisis, how big this crisis is, and what the implications of that are for reimagining the university space and university culture. Also, the question of what happens with academics who expect to keep the university moving, but we are always stuck with this question of how do we implement the changes, and ultimately the broad question of what the difficulty that comes with making legitimate change. Then I asked the question related to leadership that has been designed and embraced by a culture of cruelty, and where leaders have been put into the system and mentored and groomed into an anti-Black culture. So how then are we going to effect legitimate change? Nomalanga brought it back to Zeleza's comment regarding leadership and academic bullying as a key concern within the university space. Then Sibusiso proposed that we have to address the notion of institutional culture. Sibusiso, you made a reference to Nhlanhla Make's work. If I heard that correctly, perhaps if you could type that into the chat room in case I've mentioned the incorrect name. And Sibusiso proposes that we need a deep, meaningful academic interrogation of institutional culture, and ask the question of when we reimagine our institutions, how do we change the way that it's enacted moving forward. Then Cassandra highlighted how the concerns raised mirror what is going on in the USA. And she asked, how do we get into the academy and how do we transform it? So Cassandra was also quite concerned with the idea of cultivating leadership from a position much earlier on than at the associate professor level and so forth. So I just want to see what I wrote here. Cassandra proposes that we can transform the institutional culture if we are able to pool our experiences, our class, gender, immigrant experiences, and various social geographies. And then we can begin to cultivate a culture of leadership. Yeah, and you mentioned that we must do it the moment someone enters the graduate school. And then Nomalanga brought us back again to one of the questions in the chat room, in the written chat service, which asked, how should we be reconfiguring the university space? And in response, Cassandra mentioned that we must understand the contributions that we are all able to bring to the table. And I like that idea of the seat at the table, that you aren't merely accepting it, that you're actually bringing something with you. And I think the university needs to build a culture where you accept that those coming into the university have something to offer as well. So I quite enjoyed that. I'm enjoying reading it again. Then Oriol, you mentioned again, Oriol brought us back to the side chats again, saying, asking a question, so where do we go from here? Practically, what is the next step that we are going to take? And especially since universities will now be online for probably the next year or so. And with the knowledge that universities provide, this really important space to develop young academics, scholars, and so forth. And the university space allows the kind of growth and engagement that you cannot get online. So Oriol is asking, what's the way forward? Lutando then stepped in, and Lutando asked, what are we educating for? That must be our first point of departure. What is the type of student that comes to our university? And Lutando, you mentioned Nomalanga's notion of managerialism and Nomalanga's concern with managerialism. And Lutando highlighted that all these questions are informed by the paradigm we hold of the uses of the university space. So once we answer these questions, then we can determine what kind of academic we would need in these spaces. And you use this metaphor of the RDP, I think you said, then we can find the right fit for the reconstruction and development of universities. And you also mentioned these items are contextual. For example, you would have this comparative, you offered a comparison between, I think, Australian and South African institutions. And so you drew your discussion to a close by saying we need to fashion appropriate pedagogies that respond to our students' diversities and that do not become spaces of alienation for students. Then universities can become spaces of continuity of students' lives rather than spaces that expect acculturation. Nomalanga, you then brought us back. Oh, thanks, I'm seeing these comments about me stopping. Okay, I'm sorry. Other people also responded, but you'll see it on the recordings.
Oh. Yes, I think what's important to remember as well, colleagues, is that we do have those recordings. So we will be able to look back at those reflections. I think maybe just going forward, what might be a bit more important as well is for us to just bring forward some of the feedback that will that can be tackled in the final responses by Prof. Zeleza. All right, if we can move on to Prof. Michael and Saha's group.
Greetings. I will pass it on to somebody else as well. So someone else did take notes, so I will do justice as I can. Wanted to thank you again, Professor Paul Zeleza, for your presentation and the inspiration that it inspired and the questions that also evoked in the chat and also in our groups. We discussed a few things. There was this question that Ashali posed of, you know, the university is changing, ever evolving, and where does that take us? What does it look like? What should it look like? You know, where does it go from here? And so we had that kind of conversation. Also this idea of the fact of the concept of the digital divide that people have mentioned. and the notions of what is a university, what does it mean? And I don't feel I'm doing justice to the conversation, so I want to know if other people would like to contribute that were in that group. And I will share names. We can also type, in the chat so other people can go for the purposes of time. How about we do that? Is that better? Okay.
Yeah, so if people aren't comfortable to speak, we can also just read the feedback as well in the chat. So we'll move on to Dr. Dina's group for now, and then if anything emerges again from Sahar's group, please feel free to signal that you'd like to give input.
Okay, I like that I'm Dr. Dina. Thanks, Nobu. So we had quite a rich mix of participants in our group from all over the globe, but also people that have quite different relationships to the university. So of course the reflections were varied, and I'm not going to go through each one, but there was sort of, I guess you could say, three sort of areas that arose in responding to Paul's provocation. So the first was the issue of funding, impact on students, particularly an interesting highlight of one of the contributors is for students not to be seen as development cases or rescue projects, but to have a different relationship to funding. So there was the issue of funding and its impact on students, also funding and its relationship to government and to corporates. But then also to the possibility of contributions, both financially and otherwise, by those in the diaspora. There was a sort of case made that would have been really nice to have heard a bit more of that, particularly since Paul has contributed quite a bit of that in the past. Then a second sort of area that arose was around mental health, concerns around that in terms of COVID more generally, but also in terms of the turn from analog to the digital and aspects of the digital divide. And then interestingly, a question arose, which was that recognizing that most of the problematics of African universities identified in Paul's talk are those that existed pre-COVID. And many were identified by him also in his work, in other work before. So the question really then is how does COVID reinsert or foreground some of these problematics? Or what does it contribute to discussions about what the nature of the university, the African university, should be, and also what we can learn about the role of agency within this. So some really interesting contributions. If there's anyone from my group who would like to add more, please come in now.
Again, just reminding everyone that if you're not comfortable to share, you can also just type on the chat. Prof. Zeleza, we're handing over to you now again, just to conclude, give some final remarks as well, and if possible, to just tackle some of the questions that are emerging. I know that you did go through the chat earlier during the breakaway, so you are familiar with the conversation that was ensuing there. So if you could round off the conversation then by giving us some final comments and some concluding remarks.
Thank you very much. I think the comments both on the chat as well as from the discussion groups are absolutely wonderful. Before I address them, let me just welcome to this session. I see that my chancellor is in the audience, Manu Chandaria, Dr. Manu Chandaria. Is the chancellor of USIU and one of Kenya's major industrialists as well as philanthropists, for almost every sector you can imagine, health, children, education, environment, and so on. So it's a pleasure to have Dr. Manu Chandaria in the audience. I think we could spend days talking about this, all these issues. Obviously, we don't have that. Let me just make a very brief comments in terms of, I think in the presentations as well as in some of the charts, it's clear that a lot of these challenges we're talking about in the context of Africa were there before COVID. And that's absolutely true. And in fact, that's why I started sort of talking about some of those sort of generic, systemic or structural challenges of African universities. What COVID has done, for higher education, just like for any sector, is simply expose them. Certain things we were very much aware of, obviously, but the crisis has exposed the magnitude of the fault lines, the magnitude of the deficiencies, the magnitude of the dysfunctions. So it's like a mirror. Social crises, are mirrors to society. So they show you the what and all of your community, your society, and so on. So that in itself also means that I think things that we tended to pay lip service to, we can no longer pay lip service to. And therefore we have to try to find ways of addressing them. There is another dynamic which I think is important. The global nature of this crisis means that nobody has, already baked solutions. When you talk about problems in the third world or developing countries or global south or Africa and so on, there is always a tendency to assume that other people have solutions and we don't. The reality is, and that's why I try to frame what's going on in other parts of the world. Everybody is in this moment of crisis. Everybody is grappling for solutions. In other words, the global nature of the crisis and the depth and breadth of the crisis means that old models of managing universities, old ways of doing business, under question, which also means, because of its globality, that we in the global south, we in Africa, do not have to, to cede ground in thinking about solutions to other people. It's not a 10 key project that you can, you can pick from, country X and bring it to ourselves. So ironically, this is a moment of great creativity. A moment when we can, the last group talked of agency. This is a moment of great agency, that we can exercise our agency because nobody has ready-made solutions. Of course, people in other places are thinking very deeply how to deal with this crisis, and they'll come up with solutions. And if we don't come up with our own solutions, we may be forced to end up, quote unquote, borrowing those solutions. So I think, yes, it is absolutely true. A lot of these challenges were there before. They are not, simply because of COVID. COVID has simply exacerbated those challenges. And I think what is also happening at this moment, and that came out clearly in Group 2's questions, it's very profound questions. What is a university for? What are universities for? Because if we say universities are there to provide training for, professionals, give, skills and so on and so forth, yeah, that can be done. And in fact, it's being done outside universities. And COVID-19 has shown that that can actually be done outside universities fairly easily. If it's a question of skill acquisitions, the higher education space has been invaded by corporates and others in terms of providing, higher education, if it's all about jobs. There are a lot of studies now, of course, which show what kind of jobs are disappearing and what kind of jobs are being created. There was a report by the World Economic Forum that came out in October, which shows that about 87 million jobs globally will disappear in the next 5 years. And 95 million new jobs will be created. And many of them are sort of in the digital space and all that. But if you read the report very carefully, you find that actually a lot of the jobs will require soft skills more than has actually been the case up to now. And where do you get soft skills? You get soft skills from the liberal arts that teach you critical thinking, communication skills, analytical skills, give you, ability to ask very profound questions about issues. It gives you all those skills of learning how to learn in ways that become even more important. So ironically, the future of jobs is one in which the liberal arts skills, which universities really, sort of are very good at, will become even more important. Creativity and so on, and combined with the new, of course, digitalized skills that are becoming more and more important as well. So the question that we in the universities have to ask ourselves is, what is the university for? And for me, it's not just preparing people for jobs, training, building human capital. Of course, that's important, but it's much more than that. It's a space in which you cultivate citizenship, you cultivate civic values, you cultivate engagement with society that is intelligent, that is progressive, potentially. And that, it's not always true. And I think we have to ask ourselves, why is it some of the worst sort of demagogues are products of some of the best universities in terms of populist nonsense? So that element of cultivating citizenship is of course important. And then of course, it's also important in my view, a university as a space, as a moment, as a process through which you are cultivating what the American philosopher called, you're cultivating humanity. You're cultivating your own humanity, the humanity of others, and so on. And that leads to the issue that some of you raised, that the future, in my view, is not going to be one modality of teaching and learning. When a new technology comes in, or a new way of doing things, whether it's gradual or it's very sudden, and of course now we have gone to using these technologies, online teaching and learning, and so on, out of the crisis. There is a tendency to assume that it will overtake, overwhelm, override how things used to be done. That's not true. I'm a historian, so one thing I know for sure is that new technologies, first of all, technology is not neutral. Technology is socially embedded. How it's consumed, how it's produced, how it's distributed is all determined by very powerful social forces. What happens typically is that it gets overlaid on top of other technologies or other medium of doing things. So when television was created, I was talking to Andre during the break, people thought cinema and theater was going to die. But you go to the theater for a very different experience compared to watching your TV. You go to a movie house for a different experience. So technology doesn't necessarily mean that everything that happened before that may have, is going to disappear. In the teaching and learning space, what is going to happen, in my view, is that there will be these various modalities, each one of them having areas that, if they are done properly, carefully, strategically, can add to the teaching and learning experience. One is going to be, of course, face-to-face. Face-to-face will never disappear, in my view, because it serves a very different purpose. And many of you talked about it: socialization, acculturation, and so on and so forth, and just personal growth. And certainly, parents want to see the kids out of the house. So face-to-face has its place, and it will continue. Blended learning, which has already been happening, is going to, I think, expand. And there are benefits of blended learning in terms of the flexibilities that it brings about, either for, in terms of people who are working, people cannot travel to the university. You have to bear in mind that a lot of our students now don't live on campus. Many of them live very far from campus, sometimes 2-3 hours away. And I know at my own university, some of them, it takes them 3 hours to get to campus. The provision of blended learning, where they can come to campus at certain times to do certain things and do other things online and all that, becomes, of course, an opportunity caters for their own need for flexibility in terms of time and space. And then, of course, there will be the online. I think what the studies that have been done by the International Association of Universities, we did a study. I'm on the board of the International Association of Universities. We did a study just before COVID on how people were using online platforms for teaching and learning, knowledge production, and all that. And the data is very fascinating. Now, looking, and that study was done towards the end of of 2019. What is interesting is to look at studies now that have been done since then. For example, the Association of Commonwealth Universities did a very interesting study in May and I think May and June on what had happened in the interim. And there are other studies done by ACUS and so on. And what all these studies show is that the COVID-19 has demystified online teaching and learning. While a lot of people were very doubtful about it, the doubts in some cases have gone. And people believing that while online may not be still as good as face-to-face, it's much better than they thought it would be. And many of you pointed out to the pros and cons. Every technology, every instrument or every medium of delivering, has its own pros and cons. But what that demystification is going to do is that there will be, more and more younger people who may gravitate to online education for all sorts of reasons, including flexibility, because they may be working young people, in a way that would not have been the case, I think, without COVID. So in short, I don't see the, I mentioned very briefly the scenarios. Those three scenarios of restoration, evolving, and transformation are not going to be singular. They're going to be overlapping. They're going to be mixed. And each institution, sometimes maybe each country, is going to find its own ways of doing things. But I don't think we're going to go back to the pre-COVID era in everything, in the way we used to do university education. Some of the questions, in terms of leadership and so on, and the finances. One of the reasons why I focused on finances is obviously I'm an administrator. That's, frankly, that's my biggest headache right now. And the biggest headache of most university leaders: where do we get the money to run these institutions? We are all scratching our heads on how, we even pay salaries. This is not simply utilitarian or instrumentalist. This is about people's lives. The lives of our, colleagues who are faculty, the lives of our colleagues who are staff, and of course, through that, the ability for us to provide the kind of education that young people who come to our universities are looking for. So we have to solve that problem. We have to find solutions. And again, it's not a singular solution, it's a multiplicity of solutions. What I shared with you is really just this, scratching the surface. I have a book that just came out last week. The book is entitled, if you can allow me to do a little commercial, the book is entitled Africa and the Disruptions of the 21st Century. Part 5 of that book looks at all these issues of what are universities for, and all these challenges we're facing and so on. And I was writing the book during COVID. So it really forced me to think about a lot of these issues. Of course, I don't have the solutions. I'm simply reflecting, like a lot of us are reflecting, and we need to share those reflections so that we can survive as institutions. How we survive may not be in the same way we survived pre-COVID. And we need to think about how we can ensure the sustainability of these institutions. A lot of African universities in many countries, South Africa may be an exception because you still get fairly decent subvention from the state. Although my South African friends always tell me there could be more. In other countries, that's not true. That's not the case. Universities are virtually bankrupt. And what does that mean? If you have bankrupt universities, but they still exist, it means faculty are spending time running all over the place trying to make ends meet. So, and it's not uncommon in Kenya, in Uganda, in Malawi, in Nigeria, and elsewhere, for faculty to teach at 4 or 5 different universities, spending the entire day running from campus to campus, basically teaching the same thing, regardless of what the course might be. And that directly affects the quality of education. So the financial issue has to be dealt with because it is critical for the survival of this institution and certainly for their sustainability and the quality of education that we are providing and the quality of life that young people who are being educated are going to have. I asked my students, I teach 1 course a year. I asked my students a couple of years ago, how many of them would like to be lecturers? Not a single hand went up. And I asked them why. They were giggling and laughing. And they said, Prof, you see how these lecturers look like. It's almost a consumerist narrative, but undergirding it is a very important point. They drive all these battered cars, they dress like they're still in the 60s or 70s or whatever, they can't afford to have a decent lifestyle. The point is that academic labor has been devalued across Africa. Of course, in some countries more than others. Academic labor has been devalued even in the United States, in which 3/4 of the professoriate in the United States are now adjuncts who cannot make enough money sometimes to live on. In fact, you're better off working for McDonald's than being an adjunct. So these issues have to be dealt with in very serious ways. We also have to deal with the issue in our context of decoloniality, decolonizing knowledges. And this has been a project across Africa of the last at least 70 years. And in fact, in my own work on decolonization of knowledges, I argue that this project has actually been going on for the last 500 years, ever since the encounter of Africa in modern times with Europe, from the rise of capitalism and the modern world system, as some people call it, and so on. African intellectuals, diaspora intellectuals have been grappling with this issue of knowledge production, of decolonizing Eurocentric knowledges for centuries. The question that I always ask to people who are, of course, very committed to this project, which I am personally, is how well do we understand what I call, what Mudimbe called the African libraries, intellectual libraries. They are multiple. The colonial library is just one of them. How well do we understand other libraries, other epistemic systems that are part and parcel of African history? And how well are we interrogating all these, and how well are we trying to develop the kinds of synthesis that will create a new library befitting the context in which we find ourselves in. So first of all, we have to immerse ourselves, in my view, in African intellectual history, at least going back over the last 2,000 years. Seriously immerse ourselves in that and really spend time in reconstructing the kinds of knowledges that will not only help us understand ourselves better, but reposition Africa in the global arena in terms of how knowledge is not only constructed for Africa, but also globally. Because we have to remember that Africa is part of the globe, and peoples of African descent, the diaspora, are part of the world. And therefore, it is critical to ensure that when we are doing these projects, let's not be ultra-nationalistic, and really be global in a Pan-African sense, truly Pan-African sense. So the issue that, let me just address a couple more issues that I read on the chart. One was raised by the Vice Chancellor, Professor Sibongile Mutwa, in which she raised the issue what is it that we are trying to do in this sort of project of reinventing, recreating, refashioning, re-envisioning the African university. I would argue that fundamentally it's part of the old Pan-African project. The Pan-African project had 5 goals. One, of course, was decolonization. Decolonization writ large of our economies, our societies, our educational systems, and so on. Second was, of course, the whole issue of self-determination in terms of nation building and so on and so forth. Then there was the issue of development. Very powerful force, because colonialism by definition, imperialism by definition, leads to underdevelopment, the old dependency theory and all that. And you are deprived of opportunities to chart your own path in terms of material, social, political, cultural development. So that whole issue of development is very central in the Pan-African imagination. And then the fourth issue is really the one of democratization. Democratization, again, writ large, not just political, getting the flag independence and all that, but how do you create democratic cultures, democratic institutions, democratic ways of being in society that has suffered, assaults, brutalization from, non-democratic ways of doing things. Because colonialism and imperialism are not, by definition, democratic projects. So how do we think of democracy in political terms, in terms of distribution of wealth, in terms of the way we run our institutions, organizations, and so on? And the fifth area is, of course, Pan-African unity, integration, regional and global. So taking these very powerful Pan-African ideas, goals or priorities, what the late Thandika Nkandawire calls the humanistic and historic agenda of African nationalism, of Pan-Africanism, is then going to help us, think very creatively and very critically how we can, make our universities part of the liberation project for Africa. So for me, I see these questions as intersected. They're not just about the academy. They're about our way of being as a people, as communities, as societies, with all our splendid diversities and differences and so on and so forth. So once again, it was really a pleasure for me to participate in this conversation. And I trust that through the colloquium, these are the kinds of conversations that will continue. We need to ask ourselves very profound questions about our societies in general, but also the spaces in which we find ourselves located, in this case, higher education space, in which we are located as administrators, as faculty, as staff, as students, as governing boards, and of course the external stakeholders, our alumni, parents, the private sector, public sector, NGOs, CBOs, you name it. All of them have an investment in what happens in the university, and how do we think of ensuring that all these stakeholders, their engagement, their investment in higher education leads to the kinds of transformative institutions that contribute to the larger agenda of liberation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Zeleza. I think just looking even at the conversation that's still ongoing in the chat, your provocation was really, really, really powerful, and is really inviting a lot of discussion, a lot of conversation, much needed conversation amongst the colleagues. Colleagues, thank you once again for joining us. Really, it's such a pleasure to have this intellectual feast constantly, and we'll be treated again tomorrow with another session by Professor Shady and Tate.
Thursday.
Please join us again
Thursday.
on Thursday. My apologies, on Thursday. Please do join us for that session. Thank you again. People can start leaving. Remember, we're going to keep the recording and keep the chat, and we'll be able to send everyone the link once everything is finalized. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you very much. Thanks, Nobu.
Thanks, Andre. Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Nobu. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, very good. Bye-bye.
Thank you.